make America great again. How can you be against?
We are not going back.
Welcome to Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey, and I'm joined by columnist James Hohmann and our most frequent flyer, JM Rieger, senior video journalist. We're missing Rhonda Colvin today because she is on Capitol Hill. She was chasing news about the House ethics report on Matt Gaetz, but now there is breaking news. Matt Gaetz has withdrawn from consideration to be Trump's attorney general. And now that is breaking just as we record Sidebar, but here's what we can tell you. Gaetz announced this news on social media this afternoon, Thursday afternoon, writing that he had excellent meetings with senators yesterday and he appreciated their thoughtful feedback. He goes on to claim that the momentum was strong, but, quote, it was clear that my confirmation was unfairly becoming a distraction. Now, our colleague Leanne Caldwell reports that Mitch McConnell's reaction to Gaetz withdrawing was, I think that was appropriate. James, how did we get here? Because it sounded like Donald Trump was willing to take on this fight.
There were about 30 Republican senators who privately did not want to vote for Gaetz, and they were hoping it wouldn't actually come to them having to vote on the floor against him. And so this...
I mean, there's like a you jump first, right? No one wanted to be the one to take the no vote and defy Trump.
Right, and be the pivotal vote, stopping Trump from enacting his agenda. So this spares them that, and clearly enough Republicans had told Gaetz and the Trump team, like, look, you're going to fail at the end of the day. We're not going to vote for you. It's only going to get messier if you stick around.
And it continued to get messier today.
It did. So what we do know is that the House Ethics Committee voted on Wednesday. They deadlocked about releasing their report. They're going to meet again in a couple of weeks. We know from reporting that while Gaetz denies all allegations, a 17-year-old testified under oath that she was paid to have sex with Matt Gaetz when she was a minor. And we know that there were payments totaling $10,000 made over places like Venmo and PayPal. And two women said that they were paid to have sex with Gaetz. Gaetz denies all wrongdoing. The Justice Department decided not to bring charges after a 2-year investigation. But there is some fresh reporting today that there might have been additional women or additional sexual encounters, and it was going to continue to trickle out. It wasn't going away.
Now, he resigned from Congress, JM. He resigned from this current Congress, but Gaetz was just reelected and a new Congress starts in January. Could he come back?
Our understanding is that he could, that he resigned for the remaining term here, which runs until the end of the year. And then when the new Congress is sworn in early January, Gaetz was elected to that Congress. So he can take the oath of office and be sworn in. What's interesting, though, is that by resigning, in theory, the Ethics Committee had lost jurisdiction because he was no longer a current member. But if he takes the oath in January, then they would again have jurisdiction and this report could again potentially come out and the investigation could further. Which
is, very explosive and damaging.
And what Matt Gaetz had been planning to do is run for governor of Florida in 2026. Ron DeSantis is leaving and he still could. I think it's one of those things where like the Ethics Committee report could still come out, even if he decides not to rejoin Congress. Is it worth it?
Correct.
It's going to be fascinating to see, especially because Republicans are going to have such a narrow House majority that every seat, even a troublemaker, counts toward Mike Johnson's speakership.
And this is something that Johnson and other House Republican leaders had said. Please, President-elect Trump, don't take any more of our members.
Except Matt Gaetz.
Right, because our majority was
because they really don't like him. He's really frustrated a lot of his colleagues.
And they've already been on a knife's edge this Congress in terms of getting things through the House. So you can only imagine when they control both chambers, but it's still on a knife's edge in the House.
Well, the AP is now called the Alaska race. Goes to a Republican. So the one House seat in Alaska is going to be Republican. The Democrat lost her incumbency. So Republicans get that seat now. Took them a while to finish counting all the votes. So Matt Gaetz was on Capitol Hill yesterday with J.D. Vance, making the rounds, hearing from senators. Today, J.D. Vance, vice president-elect, is doing the same thing with Pete Hegseth. Hegseth, Fox News host, of course, is Trump's pick to be defense secretary. So we'll see how those meetings go. Donald Trump, as president-elect, is continuing to build out his cabinet picks and his staff, all with the aim of hitting the ground running on day one. So today on Sidebar, we're going to look at what exactly can Donald Trump do literally on day one. What can he do with only the power of the presidency? What will take a little longer? So what could he also do in year one with the additional power of a Republican House and a Republican Senate? We'll also talk today on Sidebar about RFK Jr. We'll do a deep dive into Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Donald Trump's pick to run the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, just like Trump, Kennedy has promised a long list of changes to public health policy. So we'll talk through what he can actually do, what might be harder, and then what on his agenda might conflict with conservatives and big business interests that surround Donald Trump. Let's dive in. So Trump becomes president on January 20th. JM, for months now, you've been tracking Donald Trump's promises of what he will do right away. So let's listen to a mashup of Trump pledges for day one.
He says, you're not going to be a dictator, are you? I said, no, other than day one. We're closing the border, and we're drilling. After that, I'm not a dictator. I will appoint a real special prosecutor to go after the most corrupt president in the history of the United States of America, Joe Biden.
Will you pardon the January 6 rioters who were convicted of federal offenses?
I am inclined to pardon many of them. On my first day back in the White House, I will terminate every open borders policy of the Biden administration, stop the invasion of our southern border, and begin the largest domestic deportation operation in American history. We have no choice.
That's a mashup of Donald Trump on the campaign trail and his day one pledges. JM, what's like the overarching tone or aim for Donald Trump as soon as he gets in office?
A through line throughout his campaign was how he wants to centralize power in a second term, and also run an administration based at least in part on retribution, right? He's talked about going after his political enemies. We heard just now in that clip there talking about appointing a special prosecutor to investigate Joe Biden. And we were just talking about Matt Gaetz, the Department of Justice, the Attorney General. Trump wants someone in there who's going to do his bidding, who is going to look into his political enemies. He's said that over and over again on the campaign trail. And this is something that when we talk about these day one promises and goals of Trump, this is something that is well within his purview.
So let's talk about migrants and mass deportations. Immigration came up a lot on the campaign trail. James, what can Donald Trump actually do?
What he has said is he wants to do something in the model of what Dwight Eisenhower did when he was president. And he actually has quite a lot of power. You need some funding to do it, but you can divert money. He essentially, anyone who's in the country illegally can be deported. There are, you need to take them somewhere. You need to.
There's logistics.
There's a lot of logistics involved. One of the things that sort of makes the day one stuff a little more complicated is that Trump hasn't signed the memorandums of understanding with the General Services Administration. He's not doing the traditional background clearance checks. And so even though Stephen Miller, for example, is going to be the Deputy White House Chief of Staff, he won't need Senate confirmation, but you need people in the agencies to actually execute this stuff. And the handoff, even though Trump has announced a lot of these names early, the handoff has been slower just because they haven't signed the various forms to get access to documents and various emails. That doesn't mean that they're not going to be able to do it, but it might actually be harder to do everything like at 12:01 p.m. on Monday, January 20th. But with deportations, he has a lot of goodwill, or whatever the right word is, from ICE, from the people in the immigration enforcement community, the Border Patrol. They're very simpatico with the Trump agenda. Remember at the Republican convention, people were waving signs that said mass deportations now. I expect what's going to happen is that they are going to start by focusing on the people who are convicted of crimes, and especially people who've been convicted of violent crimes. And they're going to go after sanctuary cities. They're going to go into cities where the local authorities don't cooperate with the federal government in terms of handing over undocumented immigrants. So I think they'll make a show early on about trying to avoid sympathetic cases of, some families nanny, they're
or children,
that
that go to local schools, or
I think
people that work in factories,
right.
or people that have been your neighbors for 20 years.
So I think they will go into the factories. I think they're going to do workplace raids, which have not happened under Biden. I do think that they're going to do they're going to do some showy things. What will be interesting is the corporate pressure. For example, the agriculture industry is already lobbying because they need the workers in the fields. And so you have companies that are warning that prices are going to go up even more, and there's going to be shortages and food problems and all those kinds of things. And so do those lobbying efforts at all impact Trump, or does Trump really feel like he has a mandate to actually do these mass removals?
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge the framing here, because you talk about like what are sympathetic cases, like a family's nanny that implies like a legal family's undocumented nanny.
Right.
But they're undocumented people all throughout society.
Totally.
They're assistants at schools, they're in classrooms, it's like we're framing it through like, oh no, don't take away my helper.
Right.
But it's also like families we're talking about. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do,
like,
and I'm very sensitive to that.
Who does it matter to?
Right. And how are we going to, I think like it's going to be interesting, because I think, how the public responds. There's a long history with immigration where whatever party is in power, like the sort of opposite view takes hold. So like, during the first Trump administration, like immigration had never been more popular. People, the polls showed there was like widespread support for allowing immigrants, and, Trump tapped into this, immigration. When Trump came down the golden escalator and started talking about how Mexicans were sending rapists and criminals not their best, like 1% of Americans in polls said immigration was their top issue. He like made this front and center. And so there was backlash to family separations during the first term, where people saw pictures, horrible pictures of kids in cages, of, a father and a child drowning at the Rio Grande. And so that led to backlash. And then Joe Biden's more lax policies, he sort of changed and evolved, but that led to a backlash where it was sort of like too many people have come across. And so the pendulum swung again. And so what I do expect to happen is the pendulum will swing back once this is no longer sort of a abstract conversation, but once you actually have like cases where, honestly, there are people who could be sent back to Mexico who don't really speak Spanish because they've been living in the U.S. for decades.
So, hold that. So we're going to talk a lot about this in the coming weeks, because this is going to be a big issue going forward. I want to refocus us on what he can do right away. So let me just play Stephen Miller, as you said, coming in as the deputy chief of staff. He was on Fox News just this week. Listen to what he says, but also the tone.
It's going to be at light speed, Sean. The moment that President Trump puts his hand on that Bible and takes the oath of office, as he has said, the occupation ends, Liberation Day begins. He will immediately sign executive orders, sealing the border shut, beginning the largest deportation operation in American history.
Stephen Miller on Fox News. JM?
I think you look at what the folks close to Trump, so Stephen Miller, for example, who's been a close advisor for years for Trump, but also just look at Trump's own words, right? Who's also said that, who's referenced Dwight Eisenhower over and over again as a model that he wants to follow. I think what's especially notable about what Stephen Miller's saying right there about what Trump said repeatedly on the campaign trail in terms of this quote unquote mass deportation, they want to use the military. They want to use military resources to do this. They've said they want to do this. Trump has floated, and officials around him have floated using the Insurrection Act to deploy the military, which would be the first time since, I believe, the Civil Rights era where you would have, because presumably you would have some states that would not request this help. This would be the first time since the Civil Rights era that a president had deployed military resources domestically like this without request from a governor, for example, for help for doing this. Tom Hohmann, Stephen Miller have talked about co-opting.
No relation.
Yeah, no relation.
Spelling.
Yeah.
But who is been tapped as the borders are for Trump here. They've talked about deputizing retired ICE agents to do this. They've talked about taking over National Guards in states and deploying those and deputizing those to make arrests. They've talked about deploying other military resources, including where you detain folks, because once you go and if they go and do these mass raids, for example, then they need to still go through a due process before a judge. And what's interesting about that is there's already millions of people waiting hearings. So then on top of this, what Trump wants to do is invoke the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 and expedite some of these folks for removal. But all of this is a legal quagmire, frankly, for the Trump administration. So while there is a lot that they can do, almost certainly they are going to face a litany of lawsuits and legal hurdles to overcome this. And that's really the question going into 2025 here.
So there's legal hurdles that then create injunctions and stop actions. And then there's things that you can do and the legal process catches up weeks, months, even years later.
So temporary restraining orders, TROs, we're going to hear that term a lot at the beginning of the administration. 8 years ago, that first weekend, Trump came in and signed basically the Muslim ban, and it was frozen by a judge in Washington State, and it was poorly written. It didn't go through the interagency process. The State Department hadn't signed off on the language. It was really messy, and the question now is, will they be a little savvier about doing it to try to prevent temporary restraining orders? The other thing is, 8 years ago, there weren't 3 Trump-appointed Supreme Court justices willing to allow things to go forward, and basically a 6-3 conservative majority. So I think that the courts, well, you're certainly going to have some district judges who are very sympathetic to the ACLU and challengers. The justice system, I don't think, is going to be as assertive writ large as it was during Trump 1.0.
What can Trump do with his pen, like literally on day one, as Stephen Miller talked about, versus what will take Congress and budgets and things like that?
So he has said he wants to do another travel ban, and he can do some of this stuff unilaterally, I think. And even let's look at the first term when he was trying to build the wall, right? He co-opted Pentagon funds, billions of dollars, to build miles and miles of wall on the southern border. One of the key things that he's going to try and do here is reallocate, and what congressional Republicans are going to try and do is reallocate funding levels for some of these agencies. James was talking about all the resources that are going to be required, and some estimates have put this at tens of billions of dollars, this mass deportation operation that they say they want to do. Where does that money come from? Does he take it again from the Pentagon? Is it the building the wall on steroids, if you will, in terms of how they went about doing that? The other thing, I think the court's point is a great point, because Trump appointed a ton of judges across the country and then at the Supreme Court as well. So he is in a better position from that standpoint to not face necessarily the injunctions, the legal hurdles, maybe to the same rate that he did last time. But broadly, he has a lot of authority over immigration. Even on the refugees issue, he dramatically reduced the number of refugees that the U.S. admits during his 4 years. And that he did that unilaterally. He has the purview to decide that.
So people like the Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, who are here legally, dreamers who have legal status right now, can he go after groups like those?
Temporary protected status, yes. And I think there are some rule. You can't just sort of like kick those people out on day one. They are here legally, the Haitians in Springfield. But you can say, we're not extending temporary protected status. We're gonna, it would be more of a phase in, but he can definitely do that. Yeah.
So our colleague Anna Roy was on Capitol Hill this week talking with members of Congress about Trump confirming, yes, I plan to do mass deportations. I plan to use the military. And here's the reaction that she got from Congressman Dan Bishop, Republican of North Carolina. You'll hear Congressman Bishop, you'll hear Anna asking a follow-up question, and then you'll hear the congressman again. Let's listen.
He said that it's going to be necessary. I think all means that are necessary and appropriate to accomplish the task. It's a massive task that Biden and Democrats have saddled the country with, and it's going to have to be dealt with. So,
what will that actually look like, though, deporting potentially millions of people?
Don't know. We'll see.
Right at the end there, the congressman says, don't know. But what you're hearing from the congressman is a willingness by Republicans to be on board with Trump's agenda, James.
Totally. I think that, they feel they have a mandate to do this. I mean, it's not like Trump hid from this. Like he talked about it front and center, every rally, every event. We've seen really wild reporting of quotes from people saying, that they're fine if their families get deported, or they don't think their family's going to get deported. There are a lot of people who voted for Trump, including Latinos, fully expecting that there would be this mass deportation. I don't think the public is priced in the fact that this would actually supercharge inflation. It would lead to shortages. It would lead to a lot of problems. And that's why I do think Trump isn't actually going to try to go after 10 million people at the end of the day, because he'll be convinced that it's too disruptive.
Let's talk about other things on Trump's agenda. What does he plan to do at the Justice Department right away? What does he plan to do to go after enemies like Joe Biden?
I mean, he wants the Justice Department to do his bidding. He's talked about how.
But let's talk about day one. Like, what can he do?
Well, some of it depends on who he's going to pick as Matt Gaetz's replacement as AG.
Correct. And he said he wants to appoint a special prosecutor to go after Joe Biden. We'll see if he still does that, right? He kind of floated that in some ways for Clinton and then never followed through back in 2016 going into 2017. He's going to need to get whoever's attorney general is confirmed as well. And we'll see how much of a setback this has created. But they can start confirmation hearings once the new Congress is sworn in. That's early January. So that's before Trump's sworn in. So there is a scenario where, depending on how the Senate wants to prioritize different nominees, they could have those hearings and potentially have some folks in place by day one, so Trump can start doing those things. Otherwise, some of this stuff is going to need to wait until he has some folks in positions.
He's talked about pardoning January 6th, people who've been convicted of crimes on January 6th.
It was really interesting. On Wednesday, a judge that Donald Trump appointed here in D.C. said in open court, it would be deeply disappointing because this in this particular case, it's a guy accused of being among the most violent people that day. He was really attacking cops. The trial has now been postponed until after Trump takes office, and the judge basically saying, I hope that Trump doesn't do blanket pardons if he does pardons, but that anyone who assaulted a cop or committed violence in the Capitol should not get pardoned. And so I think Trump actually, when you saw even the clip we played a minute ago, he has hedged a little bit. He's never said blanket pardons for everyone ever. He said, I'll strongly lean toward it. I think my hunch is that there will be some kind of process. And remember, Trump he's going to give an inaugural address. And it will be interesting because he has all these vengeance priorities and promises that he's made, but also we have heard at least some rhetorical nods to trying to heal and trying to extend an olive branch and on election night and others. And so, I think if as they're thinking through your first day executive orders and actions, are you going to give an inaugural address that's sort of now is the time to come together as a country, and then 10 minutes later start busing people out of the country versus announce we're hiring a special prosecutor to go after the deep state? I think that there is some tension there that they are actually mindful of, and so some of the more controversial stuff that we're talking about, do they kind of wait to announce that they're doing it the Friday night after he takes office versus the first day where he could sign some executive orders allowing basically undoing a lot of Biden's executive orders. I think that you could have a scenario where the first day is sort of I'm going to undo these 25 things Biden did.
Yes.
And that's pretty popular and it sort of feels good. And then he saves some of the weaponization of government for later.
6 whole days.
Exactly. Well, or 4. I'm trying to game out what the first day
and
looks
day one has always been sort of a rhetorical tactic for these candidates, right? That really means oftentimes first 100 days or first year.
Yeah. Let's talk about impoundment.
Yeah.
Explain, first of all, what this is and what it means. And we'll talk more in a moment about the power that Congress has versus the power of the presidency or the executive branch. But talk about how impoundment factors into this, James.
So this is Congress passed a law in 1974, Watergate era, and it's never really been challenged. Basically, what the congressional law says is if Congress appropriates money, the president has to spend it. And what conservatives have said is, well, Congress can appropriate the money, but the president could just be I'm not going to spend it. I refuse to spend it. And so in that way, you could actually have budget cuts. And so that's when you hear Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk talk about like cutting lots of spending. They're talking about doing it that way.
Or eliminating the Department of Education.
Which they can't do. That would require.
But they could cut the spending.
They could
just not spend the spending.
Exactly.
Not spend the money.
Right. They could zero stuff out, but there's actually like quite a lot that the Department of Education does. You would need 60 votes in the Senate to get rid of the Department of Education. And there's a lot of things that the government is required to do legally that the Department of Education does. And it's not as easy as just like waving a wand, which is why these departments never go away, even though Republicans have been promising to do it for decades. Impoundment is really interesting because in some ways, Donald Trump's like a big spending populist. He's not like a traditional small government conservative. And this is where his coalition is sort of weird because, he's out there saying, I'm not going to touch Social Security and Medicare, and we're going to increase the defense budget. But then you have these, Doge folks saying like, we're going to cut trillions in spending. And those things are at odds. Like
are you going to cut the VA?
Right.
Are you going to cut the defense? Are you going to cut Social Security,
right.
Medicare, and Medicaid?
It's much easier when you're sort of like, we're going to get rid of this and this and this. And then as soon
we look
as
at the big pocketbook items, see what they're spent on.
Exactly. So that's why I sort of, my view, and we're taping, so I could end up looking like a total moron, but
okay, bookmark this.
Exactly. I just don't.
Control room.
I
we'll
think
play back the tape in 3 months.
I think they'll do like big outlandish stuff, but it's hard to see them following through on a lot of this stuff that they're talking about.
But I think it's important, James, that you're saying they may not eliminate the Department of Education, but they could put the squeeze on things that make it very hard for departments to function.
Right.
They can essentially encourage people to resign by doing things like return to work mandates and other things like that they're starting to talk about in the federal government ranks. JM, final thoughts from you before we talk more about the first year of Trump.
Yeah, on the impoundment, and then the other thing we haven't mentioned is that he will probably issue an executive order, whether it's day one or very early, is the Schedule F stuff, right? Yeah. And both of these things tie into what we were just talking about earlier with the deportations, right? Because again, they need to find resources and funding for stuff. So if he tries to challenge the constitutionality of the Impoundment Control Act, right, and tries to then start reallocating funding that way, that's something we could see. And Schedule F, just to catch up our viewers and listeners, is this idea they put this executive order in at the end of Trump's first term, which would have forced out tens of thousands of career federal officials. And given the White House.
These are not political appointees.
Correct.
These are people who've been there through all the different administrations.
Correct. And then given the White House, the oversight essentially to appoint loyalists into those positions, right? And also potentially just cut the federal workforce broadly. There's a situation where he could use this and then try and also implement some of this stuff, whether it's Justice Department, Department of Education, immigration, right? So these are tools in their toolbox that they are going to try, and they are going to try and push. They've said they are going to try and push the legality, the constitutionality. They are prepared to go to court to defend these things.
James going to leave us now. James, you're staying with me. Rhonda's still running around Capitol Hill now getting reactions to the news that Matt Gaetz has withdrawn from consideration as Attorney General. Did you all notice we were talking really fast? I think that we have so much to say. There's so much that's happening. I mean, this is going to be a transformative administration, and a lot can happen on day one. A lot can happen in the first 100 days, and they're coming in with more knowledge, experience, and a more loyal group of foot soldiers to get it done.
And majorities in both chambers to get stuff through, right?
Even this afternoon with the Gaetz news breaking, right as we were about to tape, it is kind of like it feels like 2017 again.
I think we're all reminded, those of us who covered the first Trump administration are reminded, let's separate the politics out of it, just like the crazy pace and the frenetic nature of it, and the like turn left, turn right, turn up, turn down. It's really a wacky way to run something. And it's very reactive for those of us who have to chase it and cover it. Thank you so much, JM. James, stick around. Everybody else, stay with us. We'll talk a little bit more about what Donald Trump could do in the first year in office with the help of a Republican Congress. And we'll also do a deep dive into RFK Jr. This is Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey, and I'm here with James Hohmann. And then there were two. James, let's talk about what Donald Trump needs the support of Congress for to get through. He has a big agenda of things that he's talked about at rallies, but there are other things that like Republicans on Capitol Hill want and expect him to do, like extend the tax cuts.
And that's going to be the biggest thing, honestly. You know, the biggest thing Congress will do in 2025 is the Trump tax cuts are expiring at the end of the year. They have to deal with it in order.
So let's just, if Kamala Harris were elected, she would just let them expire.
I don't think she would actually, because I think because it would functionally effectively mean a tax increase for like the middle. I think what she would have done is negotiate with the Hill and said like, let's get rid of these, but you know, if we can increase the corporate tax rate 3%, then I'll allow these to, you know, like so I think that there would have been a negotiation the way Barack Obama ended up extending the Bush tax cuts.
Totally.
But
it's so hard to take back tax cuts.
It really is.
But it's when it's for corporate America or big corporations, it's like there's more of an argument to be made there for sure in terms of like people's perception of it.
Right.
Or the biggest earners, which is really what Trump was
and that's
giving the big hand to.
Overwhelmingly, the benefits went to corporations and the richest people. But there were benefits for others, which people don't want to lose. I mean, what's going to be interesting is to what extent do they want to pay for these tax cuts? The old, the trickle down school of Republican economic theory is like cutting taxes generates more economic growth, so we don't actually need to pay for these. And that was the argument they made in 2017. And of course, the debt got trillions of dollars worse because they didn't make it up. And so this time there are conversations underway among people like Mike Crapo, a Republican senator from Idaho, who is saying like, no, we need to have some pay fors. Like this we have $25 trillion in national debt. We can't keep blowing things up. And so it'll be interesting then, because what do you cut? And that's where, to our previous conversation with JM, that when the rubber hits the road, like there's a constituency, and when you have a narrow majority, things you wouldn't expect. Even like we talked about TPS for Haitians, like there actually are
temporary status
for Haitian. There are Haitian Republicans in Florida, and Marco Rubio, who will have a role in immigration as Secretary of State, like he will listen to what they have to say. Rick Scott, very conservative Republican senator, will hear them out. And so, that's the way government's supposed to work, right? On the tax cuts, that won't happen right away because it's an incredibly complicated negotiation, and it doesn't have to happen until the end of the year. People who followed the first Trump term will remember the term reconciliation, budget reconciliation. It's another thing that dates back to the 70s. And basically, it means that you don't need 60 votes in the Senate to break a filibuster. It's essentially to pass the budget. You only need 50 votes. And budget reconciliation rules are complicated, and because it has to be spending related, and you can't really make policy changes. So like you couldn't do a national abortion ban, for example, in budget reconciliation. But the tax cuts, because they won't get 60 votes, will need to be part of this, and they get 2 bites at the apple. And so they have to decide, what are you going to try to pack in here? They'll have some extension of the tax cuts. And remember, Trump also made all these other promises, like no more tax on tips to win Nevada, and no more tax on Social Security benefits, which would be very expensive. You're giving up a lot of revenue. And, one of the things with like tips, for example, Trump did run on that. Kamala Harris embraced it. Like, do you draw that in a way that, there's some kind of cap? It's one of those things where if you just say no more taxes on tips, you and I will both soon be paid via one large annual tip. Like people will, and with Wall Street, when you get into these tax situations, like everyone is trying to get loopholes and, like special advantages. You can imagine if you were.
Yeah, which is totally different than like someone who works at a hair salon and relies on tips, or as a restaurant worker who relies on tips. Absolutely.
So how do you draw? And those people don't have lobbyists.
Right.
But the people who, the Wall Street folks do. So anyway, it's going to be, it's going to be epic. And that is going to be like the big dominant fight on Capitol Hill of 2025.
Tariffs?
So a lot of that can be done unilaterally. it was not what the founders intended. Originally, but Congress did pass all the tariffs. Over time, they sort of deferred a lot of that power to the executive branch. The irony is that the assumption was that letting the executive make the tariff policy would mean fewer tariffs. And Trump's obviously going to turn that on its head. In his first term, Trump used a lot of sort of like national security justifications to be able to act unilaterally to impose tariffs on like Canada, even though there's obviously no national security concern with Canada. I expect he'll do the same. One of the things about tariffs that doesn't ever get talked about in like the most of the public conversation is it actually is a form of revenue. It's an inefficient, bad form of, the other side, whoever we're putting the tariffs on can retaliate by raising tariffs on our products. But you actually could raise, trillions of dollars from tariffs. And so I think there's actually an argument to be made that if you're like a free market person, you want Trump doing it because then he can negotiate and maneuver them. Whereas if Congress passes tariffs, then Congress has to pass to undo them. And so then we're sort of stuck because it's really hard to pass anything. But so I think I would be surprised if there was some tariffs bill out of Congress, but I do expect Trump will actually follow through. And one of the big outstanding jobs we're still waiting to hear is the Treasury Secretary. And I'm told that Trump really hasn't been super excited or comfortable with anyone. And part of the challenge is he wants someone that the markets are going to like. He wants Wall Street to be doing well, but who's also willing to sell his tariff plan, which would be an economic disaster. And so you need someone who is sort of popular enough and well-liked enough that, but will also implement, frankly, an agenda that like every economist agrees is problematic.
We will be talking much more about all of these agenda items, but I want to pivot now to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., because much like Donald Trump, he's promised a lot, he's talked about a lot, but there's a real question of what he can do if indeed he is confirmed as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So tell us about RFK Jr. and first of all, how has he gotten so popular? Because it really is a fascinating trajectory.
Like a sideways, he sort of became popular in a sideways.
Yes.
And I do think a lot of it.
And what we mean about that is he's popular among some varied groups. Social media influencers are very powerful on platforms like Instagram when it comes to health and wellness. And they're popular especially among moms, especially among young women, millennial women. And RFK has sort of come in through this side door as someone who's promoting health and wellness issues and tapping into like fears about, child health, but also talking about like all the chemicals that are in our products, which is like the leftist environmental perspective that many people, parents especially, are very curious about and concerned about. But he's really a mix of like these leftist environmental ideas and these like libertarian, completely not based in science ideas about health and wellness.
Well said. I think some of this can be viewed as an aftershock of the pandemic when, schools were closed for a long time. The people's lives were upended. People were away from their families. I think there was the experts, the public health folks, their reputation took something of a hit. And I was just looking at some polling this morning that showed like 37% of Americans in a most recent Pew study say they never trust the public health experts, which is a mind-blowing, and it's sort of scary when you think about another pandemic or another big public health emergency.
Or vaccines to prevent things like polio or the measles.
And so I think RFK had a popular, that's how he sort of, people were hearing him out. And I do think, I think when you talk to public health experts, what they'll tell you is sort of, it was partly because it got so politicized and everything, but when the vaccines were being rolled out for COVID, it was sort of like, these are safe and effective, period. And there wasn't, they are safe and effective. And they've sort of changed the messaging a little bit to be like the benefits outweigh the risks and more sort of acknowledging what the risks are rather than just being like, they're safe and effective.
Trust
and,
us, yeah.
And trust us.
No questions asked.
Right, exactly. And that was what, so I think like the kind of
Yeah.
like the feeling that you couldn't ask questions. I think that's part of what RFK appeals to. I'm fascinated by him. You know, a bunch of people I went to college with, to your point about, you know, young moms, like are really like have become big acolytes of RFK Jr. And it's really striking because these are like, these are Democrats and progressives in many cases.
But some of RFK's ideas go against like big business and who holds the power in the Trump administration.
It's really true. RFK Jr. has said he has a list of 4,000 food additives that he wants to ban. One story that he loves to tell is about how the Fruit Loops for sale in the US have all these chemical additives that the Fruit Loops for sale in Canada don't. And he wants to ban those food dyes. Republicans are not just traditionally the party of big business and big ag, but they're also a very rural party. And, you know, a lot of the big food industry is really based in these red states. And some of those senators are the most skeptical right now. They're trying to hold out for various promises and concessions before they vote to confirm him, to say like, don't come after this industry or don't come after this industry. You know, it's
Fiction and getting out the list. How many?
4,000.
4,000, and you can go after this one, but not this one, right?
Exactly.
Oh my gosh.
So that, I mean, I think like it will, those fights, you know, but I think there's a lot of people who are sort of like, yeah, maybe we should get rid of some of these food additives.
Well, like Jared Polis,
exactly.
the governor of Colorado, is, you know, expressed that there's some potential here. And then there was some backlash among Democrats to be like, oh, don't open the door on RFK Jr. But another sort of complication here, James, is that would require more regulation, right? And Trump is starting DOGE, this whole thing that's supposed to like cut out the government, cut out regulation, get rid of it, right?
Yeah.
So how do those two things square?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be one of those big questions. Trump has so far said he's going to sort of defer to RFK, and that as long as RFK doesn't try to touch oil, he'll leave him alone. I don't believe that. I think that once RFK actually starts kicking these various hornet's nests from big ag, from pharma, and, you know, I mean, one of the things he can do is limit. He controls which vaccines get liability coverage. There's a lot of power that the Secretary of Health and Human Services has just under the statutes. And so if he says these vaccines won't get liability protection anymore, all these companies have said, we'll just stop producing the vaccines because we can't risk the liability. And so there's going to be stuff like that where if all of a sudden companies stop manufacturing certain vaccines, that will cause, I think, a massive backlash. And so he's never actually held elected office before. So he's coming in and, you know, I think he's going to pick some fights that he's going to lose, but there are fights that he may win. And part of it is to the point about RFK wanting to get rid of these food additives. When you talk to scientists, they agree ultra processed foods are bad for you. They do contribute to obesity. But they say that there are other things that RFK talks about and says very adamantly when he's out giving interviews that he's completely wrong about, and that there's not actually any science or research to support. For example, he said that antidepressants contribute to mass shootings. And he's made claims that HIV doesn't necessarily cause AIDS, which is totally discredited. You know, he's made comments about vaccines that are just flatly, demonstrably untrue. And so, you know, there may be some truth to some of what he's saying. There is something to be said for like making America healthy again. Chronic disease is a problem in this country, but perhaps his solutions aren't actually going to really make the difference that he says they will, or they'll make the problem worse. And it certainly is at odds with this small government conservative ethos.
Well, the first step is to get confirmed. So important step that you point out is this conversation that goes on, because all these folks go to the Hill, they have the meetings, they kiss some rings on Capitol Hill, they have a lot of side conversations, a lot of sidebars, a lot of private chats with staffers and otherwise to figure out, right, what concessions can they all pull out of each other before they agree to this.
And the other issue where concessions are being made and negotiations are happening is on abortion. The Secretary of Health and Human Services actually has a lot of influence over various things. So when RFK was running as a Democratic candidate for president and as an independent, he supported banning abortion after fetal viability, which is usually like 22, 24 weeks. And but that, he's essentially, he considers himself pro-choice. He previously supported abortion rights. And so groups like Susan B. Anthony's List aren't trying to get him to change his position on that. And, they're sort of like, that's up to the states. But there are various things that the FDA and others could do for abortion medication. And so they're trying to, some pro-life senators are holding out to try to get promises that he won't take sort of like steps to expand access to reproductive health, that kind of thing.
Yeah. James, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate it. We will be off the air next week for 1 week only because next Thursday is Thanksgiving. So we hope that you have a peaceful and restorative Thanksgiving with your family, whether you eat a highly processed meal or one that is au naturel, that you hunt yourself. Enjoy it any way that it goes, right, James?
Gobble, gobble.
And thanks so much to JM. Rhonda, we miss you. We will see you after Thanksgiving back on the Vodcast and podcast. A reminder that you can watch us on YouTube. Just look for The Washington Post. Or you can, of course, listen to us on your favorite podcast app. I'm Libby Casey. Thank you so much for joining us for Sidebar.